Hey friend, welcome to True Crime Whispers Before Sleep. I'm really glad you're here. If you enjoy true crime stories told in a calm and relaxing way, you'll feel right at home. Before you get too cozy, tap that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling case. And if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's story.
In the quiet rural stretch of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, the morning of September 10th, 1999, began like any other for the Dishon family. Michael Dishon, a hard-working father, stepped into the soft light of dawn and made his rounds through the house. It was early, just before the school day would begin, and he checked in on his 3 children before heading off to work. Chris was 13. Michael Jr. was 14. Jessica, his eldest, was 17 years old and entering her final year of high school. That morning, Michael had one concern lingering in his mind. Jessica had gone out the night before, on a school night, and he wanted to be sure she had made it home safely. As he peered into her room, he saw her there, tucked beneath her blanket, sound asleep. A sense of calm passed through him. Jessica had always been responsible. She was a bright student, kept a steady job, and had big dreams for her future. When she was a child, she'd told everyone she wanted to be a veterinarian, but over time it became clear she had a gift with numbers, managing money, playing counting games, balancing things just right. Her goals shifted. She wanted to be an accountant. Graduation was only months away. Her future was beginning to take shape. Michael Dishon left for work that morning, believing everything was normal. His boys soon followed, heading out to catch the school bus. Jessica, being older, would drive herself. The house was quiet as the day began, but by early afternoon, concern began to bloom. Jessica's mother, Edna, returned home from her job around 1:30 p.m. She noticed something immediately. Jessica's car was still in the driveway. It was strange. Jessica should have been at school by then. Edna tried not to panic. Maybe the car wouldn't start. Maybe Jessica caught a ride with a friend. Maybe she was feeling sick and decided to stay home. She stepped into the house and called out her daughter's name. Silence. A cold hush clung to the air as Edna made her way to Jessica's bedroom. It was empty. That was when fear truly set in. She picked up the phone and called her husband. Michael had no answers. He hadn't seen Jessica since that early morning check. He hadn't given her a ride. He hadn't heard from her all day. He told Edna he was coming home immediately. Together they began to search. The first thing Michael did was return to Jessica's red Pontiac Sunfire. The keys weren't inside, but her purse was there, on the back seat. Inside it were her wallet, a bottle of lotion, and her cell phone. Jessica never went anywhere without her phone. She was attached to it, always reachable. If it had been ringing that day, it had gone unanswered for a reason. The deeper they looked, the more signs of trouble they uncovered. A single flip-flop was lying on the driver's side floorboard. Nothing added up. Jessica had not made it to school. And when the family checked in with her workplace, a nearby Hardee's restaurant, they learned she hadn't shown up for her afternoon shift either. Jessica was reliable. She never missed work without calling. Now the panic was undeniable. They called the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department that evening. It was 5 p.m. Michael and Edna were desperate to file a missing persons report. But the deputy at the station didn't see it the same way. He told them to wait. Jessica was probably with friends. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she was just out late. It was a dismissive response, one that would come to define the early handling of Jessica's disappearance. As the sun dipped below the trees that evening, Michael and Edna waited at home, filled with dread, anger, and helplessness. They called again. They pleaded. They explained that Jessica had left behind everything, her purse, her cell phone, her car. Still, they were told to wait until morning. So they did, but sleep did not come. Not for Michael, not for Edna, not for Jessica's younger brothers who stayed awake, frightened and confused. Jessica was gone. No one seemed to be looking for her. Morning came with no comfort. Jessica was still missing, and the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department still had not arrived. Michael and Edna had waited through the night, hoping against hope that a knock on the door might bring news, or that Jessica herself might walk in and laugh at all the worry. But there was no knock, no laugh, no relief. The phone stayed silent. Frustration burned under the surface. Edna, determined to keep moving, opened her daughter's car again. It was a small detail she hadn't thought much about the day before. Jessica's flip-flop on the floorboard, the way her purse had been tossed onto the back seat. Now, every item felt like a clue. That's when she remembered the phone. Jessica's old Nokia brick cell phone still sat inside the bag. Edna picked it up and scrolled through it. Only 2 digits had been dialed, a 9 and a 1. Jessica had tried to call for help. She'd begun to dial 911, but never made it to the last digit. The area code for their region was 509, and it required all 10 digits for a call to go through. There was no reason she would have started dialing just a 9 inches unless she was attempting an emergency call. Edna and Michael were now certain. Something had happened in that driveway. Jessica had been taken. Still, the sheriff's department told them they had to wait. They couldn't file a report, not yet. She probably went to a football game, one deputy had said. The statement burned in Edna's ears. Their daughter was responsible, dedicated, and careful. She didn't skip work. She didn't leave without telling anyone. She didn't vanish into thin air. And now, Edna was being told to sit quietly while her instincts screamed that time was running out. They couldn't sit anymore. The Dishons decided to act on their own. That morning, Michael organized a search party. Family and friends rallied quickly. Neighbors joined. Word spread. The Dishons weren't just grieving, they were moving. If the police wouldn't search, the town would. It was in the middle of that search that a chilling moment occurred. 13-year-old Chris, Jessica's youngest brother, came running up to Michael. Breathless, he said he'd heard something. Someone calling for help from the wooded property next door. He thought it was Jessica's voice. That neighboring property was familiar ground. It belonged to the Brooks family, who had lived beside the Dishons for generations. The two families were distantly related by marriage. They knew each other, grew up near each other. There had never been trouble between them. Michael Dishon didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gun. His brother Stanley joined him. Together they ran across the fields to the Brooks property. The man who now lived there was David "Bucky" Brooks. Michael knew him. Bucky had always been friendly, quiet, maybe a little distant, but not dangerous. He had a low IQ, around 70, and often kept to himself. Still, Michael expected him to help. Instead, he was met with resistance. When Michael asked if Bucky had heard anyone calling for help, Bucky said no. When Michael asked if they could search the property, Bucky refused. Michael, emotional and desperate, yelled at him. "My daughter's missing," he shouted. "I've known you my whole life." But Bucky stood firm. He told them to leave. Michael and Stanley returned to their search with nothing to show but more questions. Why would the Brooks family refuse to help? Why, when a child was missing, would a neighbor deny them access to a property that lay directly next to the last place Jessica had been seen? No police were present to intervene. There was no authority to ease tensions or take control of the search. It was chaos, led by civilians, driven by fear. Later, the Brooks family would claim that none of this happened, that they never stopped anyone from searching. But Michael and Stanley remembered it differently, and so did the rest of the Dishon family. Even with this setback, the search continued. Michael and Stanley made their way to the Salt River bottoms. an area 5 miles north of the Dishon home. It was a quiet, isolated stretch of land, shaded by woods and far from the roads. Stanley had a grim reason for choosing it. If someone were to hide a body, he said quietly, this would be the place. Michael didn't argue. The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't something a brother wanted to hear, but it was something a father needed to consider. They walked for hours, calling Jessica's name into the trees. No one answered. Eventually, Stanley said he wasn't feeling well. His stomach was unsettled. The search ended there for the day. They hadn't found anything. The police still hadn't joined the effort, and Jessica was still missing. By the third day, the Dishon family had grown weary, not from the effort of searching, but from the weight of feeling abandoned. Jessica was still missing. The Bullitt County Sheriff's Department had still not taken action. Michael Dishon couldn't understand it. His daughter had vanished. Her phone, purse, and car were left behind. A flip-flop on the floorboard suggested she had been pulled from the driver's seat. All the signs were there, and yet the authorities insisted she'd simply run away or stayed out too long. Michael had reached his limit. He called the FBI. It was a move made from desperation, but one that finally changed everything. Within hours of his call, a formal search was launched. The FBI brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and organized volunteer teams. Agents took the lead, walking the ground, asking the questions, coordinating what should have happened 2 days earlier. Now, with professionals involved, there was hope. Hope that answers might finally come. The Dishon family felt a sudden shift. For the first time since Jessica disappeared, someone was listening. Someone was acting. FBI agents began interviewing Jessica's friends and classmates. They learned what her parents hadn't known. Jessica had been at a party the night before she went missing. Not just a casual visit with friends, but a gathering at an abandoned barn in the Salt River bottoms. It was a place teenagers went to drink, party, and stay hidden. It wasn't a location known to local law enforcement. It had been kept quiet, known only to those who passed the knowledge among themselves. Jessica's boyfriend confirmed it. They had gone to the party together. The night had been fun, he said. No arguments, no signs of trouble. But something had stood out. 2 boys had arrived late in the evening. Their names were Coulter and Dunford. They were classmates, known around town for causing problems. Some said they were drug dealers. Jessica had once been friendly with them, but not anymore. That night they hadn't caused much trouble, but the boyfriend didn't like how they spoke to Jessica. It made him uneasy. The boys eventually left with another girl and the night went on. It was the last time anyone saw Jessica Dishon alive. Despite the FBI learning this, the 2 boys were never questioned. The focus was elsewhere. Their attention had shifted to the Brooks property and specifically to David "Bucky" Brooks. The Dishons had already expressed their concerns. Bucky's refusal to let them search his land raised alarms. He had no alibi. And now, with federal agents involved, it became clear that every piece of the case pointed toward him. Rope, paint, a match to his truck, burned clothing found on his property, even gloves that looked like they had been used to handle evidence. Michael was informed of all of this. He listened quietly as the agents laid it out for him. The rope tied around Jessica's leg. Its fibers matched the rope in Bucky's truck bed. Traces of silver paint were consistent with the truck's lining. Pieces of burned clothing had been collected, suspected to have been worn during the movement of Jessica's body. To Michael, it all made sense. The neighbors he had grown up beside now seemed to be the center of a nightmare. But the FBI warned him, let the evidence do the talking. Let the investigation proceed. Don't confront the Brooks family again. For the sake of Jessica, Michael agreed. He had to trust them. They would find the truth, and all he could do was wait. 17 days had passed since Jessica Dishon disappeared. 17 days of silence, searching, and aching uncertainty. Then came the call. A family friend, volunteering under the FBI-led search, had found something deep in the Salt River bottoms. It was a place not far from the party barn, hidden beneath the thick brush and silence of rural Kentucky. It was Jessica. Her body was discovered off Greenwell Ford Road, just 7 miles from her family's home. The news arrived in the form of a knock on the Dishon's door. It wasn't the FBI who came. It was the same sheriff's department that had once brushed Jessica off as a runaway. Michael answered. The sheriff stood in the doorway, somber. He said Jessica had been found. Michael asked the question that no parent should ever have to ask. Is she alive? The answer was no. Michael and Edna collapsed under the weight of the words. In an instant, all the hope they had been clinging to vanished. Their daughter, so full of life, so close to graduation, so steady in her dreams, was gone. Edna looked the sheriff in the eye and said only one thing. Tell me she's a runaway now. The wound ran deeper than grief. It was betrayal. For over 2 weeks they had begged for help, begged for someone to look, to act, to care. But those in power had waited, and now it was too late. Jessica's body had decomposed significantly by the time it was found. Her mother, brave beyond words, traveled to the scene to identify her. It wasn't her face that confirmed the truth. It was the butterfly tattoo on her hip. The child she had carried, raised, and loved beyond measure would never grow up. She would never walk across the stage at graduation. She would never become an accountant or start a family of her own. She would forever be 17. The autopsy revealed devastating truths. Jessica had been struck with such force in the face that it shattered her jawbone. The injury had likely rendered her unconscious, but worse still was the timeline. The coroner believed Jessica had been kept alive for 1 to 3 days after she was taken. 3 days. She may have been alive when her family searched, when her name was shouted into the woods, when they walked past barns, rivers, and fields. 3 days lost to silence. The cause of death was strangulation. Her final moments were not peaceful. They were stolen. Michael and Edna laid their daughter to rest on October 2nd. Over 400 people came to honor her memory. Friends, neighbors, strangers who felt the weight of the tragedy. And as her parents grieved, the investigation deepened. More evidence was collected from the Brooks property. More connections were made. The rope, the paint, the burnt clothes and gloves. All seemed to point toward Bucky Brooks. He was questioned. He claimed he'd been at work that morning, but investigators discovered he had arrived late. At 8:30 a.m., Jessica would have left for school around 7 o'clock. When asked what delayed him, Bucky said he'd been with his wife, trying to make a baby. It was a clumsy attempt at an alibi, one that unraveled quickly when his wife denied the story entirely. She told authorities she didn't know where he'd been. He had no alibi. When asked to take a lie detector test, Bucky agreed. He failed. But that wasn't all. Burned clothing and gloves were found on the Brooks farm. Investigators believed these items had been used to move Jessica's body, possibly after the Dishon family had approached the property during their search. The pieces were falling into place. The Brooks family, once neighbors, once trusted, were now the prime suspects in Jessica Dishon's murder. And the case, once neglected, was roaring back to life. With the investigation intensifying, the Brooks family stood at the center of suspicion. The Dishons were convinced Bucky Brooks, along with at least 2 of his brothers, had something to do with Jessica's disappearance and death. The evidence felt overwhelming, and to Michael and Edna, the behavior of their neighbors only fueled that belief. Bucky had refused to let them search his property. He had no solid alibi. His wife contradicted his story, and the ropes, found tied to Jessica and discarded nearby, matched what was in Bucky's truck. Now the FBI had turned up even more. Burned clothes, gloves, and rope samples had been discovered around the Brooks farm. Agents believed these items had been used to clean up after Jessica's body was moved. It was suspected that the Brooks brothers panicked when the Dishons first came to their property and decided to hide evidence quickly. Still, there was no direct proof, no DNA match. But what existed was strong circumstantial evidence, and enough to convince a grand jury to move forward. Bucky Brooks wasn't the only one under suspicion. His brothers, including Tommy Brooks, were pulled into the investigation. The suspicion, once whispered in the community, was now a full-blown firestorm, and in a small town like Shepherdsville, word spread fast. The Dishons and the Brookses were no longer neighbors. They were enemies, and the feud had begun. Despite being distant relatives by marriage, the two families now viewed each other across a deep, widening divide. The Dishons believed the Brooks brothers had murdered Jessica. The Brooks family insisted they were innocent. Tensions escalated quickly. Phone calls, unwanted, persistent, began to plague the Dishon household. Harassment, stalking. In the weeks following Jessica's funeral, it became clear that the Brooks family wasn't just staying silent. They were lashing out. On October 23rd, less than 3 weeks after Jessica was laid to rest, David Bucky Brooks and his brother Joseph Tommy Brooks were arrested. They were charged with making harassing phone calls and stalking members of the Dishon family. The arrests made headlines in the local paper, but just 2 days later, both brothers were released on bond, $10,000 each, with a court order to have no further contact with the Dishons. Still, the damage was done. The wounds were fresh and now being poked by those the family believed responsible. The Dishons were grieving, but they were also watching, waiting, and preparing for justice. The harassment didn't end there. Just 1 week after being released on bond, another Brooks brother, Herbert, was ordered to submit hair and blood samples along with Bucky and Tommy. Investigators wanted to compare the samples to the evidence recovered from Jessica's body and the scene where she had been found. Then came another blow. On the night Jessica's body was discovered, Bucky Brooks had rented a carpet cleaner from the local grocery store. That machine was recovered, and investigators were able to extract fibers and hair. They believed it was another attempt to destroy evidence. As the FBI continued their work, tests were run on 63 pieces of evidence: hair, fibers, and other materials found on or near Jessica's body and the Brooks property. Only one sample contained usable DNA. It didn't match Bucky. It didn't match Tommy. And it didn't match Herbert. It was from an unidentified male. The Dishons tried not to lose hope, but the silence around the evidence gave the Brooks brothers room to move. And then, in July 2000, Herbert Brooks took things further. While the Dishon family gathered in their yard for a 4th of July barbecue, more than 30 people in attendance, Herbert fired a semi-automatic weapon toward their home. No one was injured, but the message was clear. The feud had become dangerous. Herbert was arrested and charged with wanton endangerment. The Dishons had lost their daughter. Now they were being threatened in their own home. The line between justice and vengeance was growing thin. And though no convictions had been made, the battle between the two families was being waged in broad daylight. As summer passed into the new year, the legal battle reached its next phase. The Brooks brothers, David Bucky and Joseph Tommy, were officially indicted. The charges: kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and complicity. Prosecutors believed that even if they hadn't acted alone, both had played a role in Jessica's abduction and death. Herbert Brooks, the eldest, was not indicted. Investigators found no direct link to the crime beyond the harassment and gunfire. Still, the damage had been done. By January 2001, more than a year after Jessica's death, the case was ready to go before a grand jury. But as court proceedings began, the town of Shepherdsville was divided. Some believed the Brooks brothers were guilty. Others believed they were being used as scapegoats. The Deshawn family came to court every day. They sat in quiet strength, wearing grief like a second skin. Michael, Edna, and their sons were determined to see justice served. They believed the evidence, while circumstantial, told a story. The rope, the paint traces, the carpet cleaner, the refusal to allow a property search, the harassment after the funeral, the change in Bucky's story, the failed lie detector test, it all added up. But the Brooks brothers had their defenders. Their attorney argued there were alternative suspects, specifically the two boys from the party the night before Jessica disappeared, Coulter and Dunford, known drug dealers, local troublemakers. They hadn't been questioned. Why? Why hadn't law enforcement looked into them? Why had they dismissed the tip about Jessica being seen after her disappearance, sitting on the hood of a black Camaro, a car one of the boys was known to drive? The courtroom turned tense as these questions were raised. The defense claimed that Jessica may have run away after all, that she might have gone willingly with those boys and something had happened later. The Dishon family sat silently. They had heard enough of those theories in the early days of the case, but now to hear them repeated in court against their daughter's memory, it was almost too much. To suggest that Jessica had been careless, that she was reckless, that she was to blame, it felt cruel. The prosecutors stayed focused. They reminded the jury of what was known. Jessica was a responsible teenager. She had never run away. She was close to her family. She had a job she cared about, and she had been taken from her driveway, leaving behind her purse, her phone, and her shoe. They pressed the sheriff's department for answers, too. Why had they waited so long? Why had they failed to act in the critical first 48 hours? The lead detective was called to testify. Under pressure from the defense, he grew defensive, and then he made a mistake. While answering a question, he mentioned something he should not have, that Bucky Brooks had failed a polygraph test. It was a moment that changed everything. Polygraph results are inadmissible in court. Mentioning them in front of the jury was a violation, a serious one. The judge had no choice. A mistrial was declared. Just like that, the trial collapsed. The jury was dismissed. The Brooks brothers, who had been incarcerated during the proceedings, were released on bond. Months passed. Another trial was scheduled. But before it could begin, the case was dropped entirely. Prosecutors announced that there was no longer enough evidence to move forward. The physical evidence hadn't delivered the proof they needed. Without new leads or a confession, the charges against Bucky and Tommy Brooks were dismissed. It was over. There would be no justice. Not then. Not for Jessica. The Dishon family watched in silence as the case that had defined their lives was shelved. No one would be held responsible. Not in the eyes of the court. Jessica's story faded from the headlines. And the investigation went cold. With the charges dropped and the Brooks brothers walking free, the Dishon family was left with nothing but heartbreak and silence. The case had gone cold. No one was held accountable. No one searched further. No one investigated new leads. Years passed. For a full decade, Jessica's case sat untouched in the archives of the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department. It became a box on a shelf like so many others, but this one hadn't been thoroughly investigated, and the Dishons knew it. They had lived it. They had felt every hour of delay, every unanswered call, every door that remained shut. Jessica was not forgotten in their home. Her room remained untouched, still decorated just as it was in 1999. Her memory was frozen in time, preserved in photographs, in birthday cards never opened, in dreams that would never come true. Michael and Edna Dishon eventually separated, but they remained united in one purpose: justice for their daughter. Even after their marriage ended, their fight continued. They returned to the sheriff's office year after year, asking questions, demanding attention, hoping someone, anyone, would reopen the case. But the answer was always the same. There's nothing more we can do. Privately, they believed otherwise. They believed that nothing was being done, not because there were no leads, but because pursuing them would expose how badly the case had been mishandled from the start. The early mistakes, the assumptions, the delays. To dig back in would mean facing the truth. So for 10 long years, the file remained closed. Until everything changed. In 2013, new leadership came to the sheriff's department. The older detectives had retired. The names tied to the original investigation were no longer present, and with that change came a new opportunity. A new detective was assigned to the case. Her name was Detective Lynn Hunt. From the beginning, she was different. She didn't treat the file like a burden. She treated it like a responsibility. She reached out to Michael and Edna personally. She met with them. She listened to them. She understood their pain, not just as an officer, but as a mother. She made a promise. I will not let this case sit cold again. Her first step was to return to where it all began, the Dishon home. Michael still lived there. Jessica's bedroom was exactly as she had left it. Dust had gathered, but the memories hadn't faded. Her journals, clothes, bedspread, it all remained. Detective Hunt took her time. She studied the case files. She reviewed every piece of evidence collected. She revisited every witness statement. And slowly a new picture began to form. To her, the case against Bucky Brooks didn't feel strong. The rope wasn't a perfect match. The fibers weren't conclusive. There was no DNA. Worse still, she saw how little had been done to investigate alternative leads. Two names stood out, James Coulter and Jason Dunford, the boys from the party, known troublemakers, known drug dealers, never questioned. Detective Hunt decided to find them, but she discovered that only one was still alive. Jason Dunford had died in a car accident. James Coulter, however, was sitting in the Bullitt County Jail, arrested again, this time on drug charges. She went to speak with him. He was hesitant at first, but eventually he opened up. He admitted he had seen Jessica the night before she vanished. He had sold her LSD. He said he and Jason had taken another girl from the party to a motel, where they stayed until late the next day. He denied having anything to do with Jessica's disappearance. Detective Hunt followed up on his story. It checked out. The motel records confirmed the stay. Toxicology from Jessica's autopsy confirmed she had LSD in her system the night she went missing. The pieces aligned. For the first time, the picture of that night was becoming clearer. Jessica had partied. She had taken something. She had returned home. And then she was taken. But if not by the Brooks brothers or the boys from the party, then who? Detective Hunt wasn't ready to stop. And just when the case felt like it might stall again, a new name emerged, quietly, from inside a prison cell. And that name would change everything. By the summer of 2013, Detective Lynn Hunt had turned over nearly every stone in Jessica Dishon's case. But the name that came to her next, she hadn't seen coming. It began with a phone call. An informant, someone already in prison, claimed he knew who had killed Jessica. He wasn't offering the name just yet. He wanted a deal. He had his own charges pending and was looking for a way out. Detective Hunt listened. She had to. Even if it was just a fishing expedition, even if it led nowhere, she couldn't afford to ignore it. She agreed to hear what the man had to say. They met face to face in a secure room. He didn't give a name, not yet. First, he shared what he knew. He described a man, angry and jealous. A man who had once had control over Jessica, but had grown furious when she got a boyfriend. He referred to the boy as that little bastard and her little boyfriend. The informant said the man resented Jessica for growing up, for distancing herself from him, and for threatening to tell someone what had been happening. Detective Hunt sat still, listening carefully. The words painted a terrifying picture. This wasn't about a random abduction. This was personal. The man the informant claimed had admitted to him that he'd been abusing Jessica for years. She had finally stood up to him. She had told him it would end, and that's when he snapped. The informant said Jessica had tried to call for help, but was stopped. She had been hit, taken, held inside a barn for 3 days, and then killed. Her body was dumped in an area he called the Bottoms. Hearing this, Hunt paused. It matched the facts. Jessica's 911 attempt, her broken jaw, the timeline, 1 to 3 days, the cause of death, the location, everything fit. Still, she asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" The man shrugged. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was strategy, maybe it was just time. Hunt made the offer. If she liked what she heard, she would help him with his case. The man agreed. Then he said the name, Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, the man who had helped lead the first searches, the man who had gone with Michael to the Salt River Bottoms, the man who had stood beside his brother while Jessica was still alive, hidden in a barn nearby. Detective Hunt felt the weight of the moment. Stanley wasn't a stranger. He was family. He had been there the whole time. Detective Hunt sat alone in her office that evening. The name Stanley Dishon echoed in her thoughts. Jessica's uncle, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Michael during the search for Jessica, a man who had shouted her name into the woods, who had climbed fences and looked concerned, a man who had seemed like a grieving relative. Could it be? She returned to the files. She reviewed every statement Stanley had made during the investigation, his behavior, his presence, his words. It all seemed too convenient. Stanley had chosen where to search. He had led Michael to a section of the Salt River Bottoms, but not near the barn where Jessica's body was later found. And on that same day, he had claimed to have a stomach ache, cutting the search short. Had he been diverting attention? Was he steering the family away from where Jessica had actually been? Hunt's instincts told her it was time to dig deeper. Stanley Dishon was already behind bars, serving time on unrelated charges, but those charges were deeply troubling. He had been convicted of sexually assaulting his own children. It was a fact the Dishon family had long denied. They believed Stanley had been wrongly accused, that his children were lying, and that he had been sent away unfairly. Now, that belief was being shattered. Hunt realized there was more than just a murder to uncover here. There was a long-standing pattern of abuse, hidden behind family loyalty and silence. And if the prison informant was telling the truth, Stanley had added Jessica to that list of victims. It made sense now, why Jessica never invited her friends home, why she had kept her social life private, why she had stayed silent about some things. She had been protecting others, just as victims of abuse often do. Detective Hunt needed proof. She remembered one detail from the confession, the buried shoe. The informant had said Jessica's other flip-flop, the one not found in the car, had been buried by a large tree near where the body was discovered. It was something no one else would know. If she could find that shoe, it would mean everything. So she went back to the Salt River Bottoms. She brought a small digging tool, and she started to search. But the coordinates in the case file weren't right. She couldn't find the exact spot. She walked the area again and again. Then a familiar voice called to her. Michael Jr., Jessica's brother, had come by to say hello. He asked what she was doing. She explained carefully that she was looking for something. Michael looked confused. "That's not where her body was found," he said gently. He pointed across the field. "There. That's where Jessica had been." Detective Hunt felt the air leave her lungs. Even after all these years, the original case file was wrong. The coordinates had been entered incorrectly. If not for Michael Jr., she would have spent days searching the wrong place. He led her to the correct site, and when they arrived, she saw it for the first time, the barn. The barn that had once been the site of teenage parties. The barn that matched the informant's story. The barn no one had ever searched. The barn stood silent and weather-worn. By 2013, its boards had faded. Its roof had sagged and vines crept along the sides. Once a hideaway for teenagers and weekend parties, it now sat hollow, forgotten by most but not by the past. Detective Hunt stood in its shadow, staring up at the entrance. It was just a short walk from where Jessica's body had been found, yet in all the years since her death, no one had searched it, not once. She stepped inside carefully. The floor creaked beneath her feet. Sunlight filtered in through broken planks and narrow shafts, casting dim stripes across the dust-covered interior. In one corner, among leaves and debris, something caught her eye. A piece of fabric, tattered, faded, but familiar. It looked like a bed sheet. She bent down, gently lifting it from the floor. There was a pattern, flowers pale and faded from time. It stirred something in her memory. She took it with her. Back at the Dishon home, she entered Jessica's bedroom, still untouched since 1999. She pulled the sheet from the barn from her bag and held it against Jessica's bedspread. The patterns matched. It was the missing fitted sheet from Jessica's bed. Gone for 14 years, it had resurfaced in that barn. Hunt now had the physical link she needed. Jessica had been there. The informant's story about Jessica being held in a barn for days, it wasn't just hearsay. It was true. Hunt continued building her case. She interviewed family members one by one. Some were hesitant, others broke down in tears. More victims came forward. Nieces, cousins, each with stories of abuse, all tied to Stanley Dishon. The pattern was clear. Stanley had used silence as his shield, but now it was cracking. Hunt arranged an interview with him in prison. She didn't tell him what she knew, not yet. She told him she was revisiting Jessica's case. Immediately he grew nervous. His hand shook, his voice faltered. He said it was just nerves. Hunt calmly began to press. She told him she knew he had been speaking to others. That word had gotten back to her. She accused him directly of abusing Jessica, of being furious that she was breaking away, and of killing her to keep her quiet. Stanley froze. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He simply ended the interview and walked out. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Detective Hunt didn't need more confirmation. What she had found, the fabric, the timeline, the behavior, was already enough. Jessica had been silenced, but now her story was beginning to speak, and the man who had walked beside her grieving father during the search was now the prime suspect. Detective Hunt knew what she had to do. The time had come to tell Jessica's family the truth. She scheduled a quiet meeting with Michael Dishon, the father who had never stopped searching, never stopped fighting, a man who had aged in the shadow of grief, whose heart had carried both loss and guilt for nearly 15 years. She sat across from him gently, her voice calm, steady, and she said the words he never expected to hear. "The person responsible for Jessica's death is your brother." Michael sat silent. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. It was as though every breath left his body. Stanley Dishon, the man who had walked beside him, who had knocked on doors, searched ditches, and called Jessica's name into the wind. Michael closed his eyes. Then, quietly, he said, "I'm not going to say I don't believe it, because I've seen where he is now. Stanley's abuse convictions, the prison sentence, the things he had done to others. It was no longer possible to deny. The monster wasn't someone far away. He had been in the family all along. When Edna Dishon heard the news, she wept, not just from heartbreak, but from shame. She had thought she knew everything that happened under her roof. She had believed she could protect her children. But Jessica had suffered in silence, and now Edna understood why her daughter had kept her social life private. why she had never invited friends over, why she had grown quiet at times or pulled away. Jessica had been carrying a weight, alone. Detective Hunt pressed forward. She returned to the site near the barn, determined to find the final proof, the missing flip-flop Jessica had lost when she was abducted. According to the informant, Stanley had buried it under a tree. Hunt searched the ground. She turned over brush, dug beside roots. Hours passed. Then at last she found it, the second shoe, buried beneath the earth near the site where Jessica's body had been found, just as described. It was the final link. Now, Detective Hunt was ready. She returned to Stanley. She wanted a confession. She confronted him with everything: the shoe, the sheet, the timeline, the statements from other victims. She painted the picture for him clearly. Jessica had threatened to tell. She had grown up, found her voice, and refused to stay silent. And when Stanley realized he couldn't control her anymore, he panicked. He hit her. He took her. He held her in the barn. And when the pressure became too much, he ended her life. Stanley said nothing. He stood up and he walked out again. That was all Hunt needed. She had her case. And the truth, buried for 14 years, was finally coming to light. The days after Stanley Dishon's exposure were marked by grief, disbelief, and reflection. It wasn't just about Jessica anymore. It was about all the lives he had affected. When Detective Hunt spoke with extended members of the Dishon family, more secrets surfaced. One by one, relatives shared stories, accounts of abuse that had been hidden for years. Nieces, cousins, even Stanley's own children. The list grew. Stanley Dishon had left behind a long, painful legacy. For years, he had controlled others through fear and silence, and somehow he had convinced many, including his own relatives, that he was innocent, that the accusations were lies. Now they knew better. Jessica had never stood a chance. She had suffered quietly. She had endured alone. And when she found the courage to speak up, when she got a boyfriend and hinted she might tell someone, it cost her everything. Detective Hunt presented her case to prosecutors. In January 2015, Stanley Dishon was indicted for the murder of his niece, Jessica. He was also charged with 9 additional counts of abuse based on the testimonies of other victims, most of them family members. In total, 12 victims were identified. The case shook the entire community. For Michael and Edna, the wounds reopened. This wasn't justice against a stranger. This was their own blood. The trial began with heavy emotions. Michael sat quietly in the courtroom. Edna, too, Jessica's brothers, now grown, sat nearby. They heard the accounts, the abuse, the betrayal, the timeline of Jessica's final days. Prosecutors laid out the full picture. They explained how Stanley had waited for Jessica to be alone that morning, how he approached her in the driveway, how she tried to call 911 but only made it to the second digit, how he hit her hard enough to break her jaw, how he likely carried her inside the house using the fitted sheet from her bed, how he kept her alive for 3 days inside the barn, and how he ended her life. The sheet, the shoe, the confession passed to the prison informant. The failed interview where Stanley said nothing and walked away. The patterns of abuse. Everything pointed to one truth. And when prosecutors described Jessica's final days, wounded, silenced, and trapped, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Stanley Dishon did not show remorse. He barely looked up. He never apologized. In the end, he didn't confess, but he did accept a plea, an offered plea, meaning he didn't admit guilt, but acknowledged there was enough evidence to convict him. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, 15 years minimum. Michael Dishon, now older and quieter, said he would be waiting when that day came, waiting for his brother to walk free, waiting to look him in the eye. Jessica's story wasn't over yet, not for the family who had lost her, not for a town still healing. Jessica Dishon should have turned 18 just months after she was buried. She should have walked across the stage in a cap and gown, smiling with pride. She should have started college, pursued her dream of becoming an accountant, built a life, found love, perhaps one day raised children of her own. Instead, her story was buried beneath years of silence, mistakes, and missed opportunities. Her absence left a space in the Dishon family that would never be filled. Her mother, Edna, often sat in Jessica's room, still unchanged. Her father, Michael, carried her photo in his wallet, every line on his face deepened by the ache of what he had lost. The wound of Jessica's murder was more than the loss of a daughter. It was the fracture of trust. Trust in law enforcement. Trust in neighbors, and most painfully, trust within a family. Stanley Dishon had stolen more than a life. He had stolen peace. The early days of the investigation had failed Jessica. The sheriff's department didn't act when she first went missing. They delayed. They dismissed. They assumed she had run away, despite the clear signs left behind: her phone, her purse, her shoe. Those first 48 hours, the most crucial, were wasted, and when her body was found, buried beneath weeks of decay, the focus shifted to the wrong suspects. The Brooks brothers became the center of the case. Their odd behavior and circumstantial links seemed enough, but nothing ever tied them directly, and the true killer stood just outside the spotlight, quiet, involved, grieving beside the family he had already shattered. It was Jessica's uncle who had led searches with her father. It was her uncle who had kept her from bringing friends home, and it was her uncle who had hurt others in the family for years undetected. The justice system eventually caught up to him, but not before 15 years had passed. Not before the Dishons were left with a lifetime of wondering what might have been. The story of Jessica Dishon is one of tragedy, but it is also one of silence. How it crept through her home, her community, and her case. In those early days, when Jessica first disappeared, silence ruled. Authorities delayed their response. Evidence was ignored. Leads were left cold. And the voices that mattered most, Jessica's, her family's, were overlooked. That silence came with a price. Had law enforcement acted swiftly, Jessica may have been found alive. Her autopsy showed she'd been kept alive for up to 3 days. During that time, her family searched. They knocked on doors. They called her name, and all the while she was suffering nearby, alone, hidden, and unheard. The barn where she was held had been just 7 miles from her home. 7 miles from the place she should have been safe. 7 miles from the people who would have done anything to save her, but it had never been searched. Not once, because the wrong people were in charge, because assumptions were made, because a quiet man, someone familiar and trusted, slipped through unnoticed. That silence extended into the courtroom. The prosecution believed they had a case against the Brooks brothers, circumstantial but compelling, but there was no DNA, no confession, no physical proof. And when the lead detective mentioned a failed polygraph test in open court, it ended the trial with a mistrial. It silenced justice. For years, Jessica's case remained closed. No new suspects, no new leads, just silence. Until Detective Lynn Hunt arrived. She listened. She asked questions no one had asked. She noticed what had been missed. She refused to let silence win. It was because of her that the truth emerged. Not from a fresh crime scene, not from a dramatic reveal, but from careful listening, small details, and the courage to believe a voice from within prison walls. And when she looked at the person responsible, she didn't see a stranger. She saw Jessica's uncle, someone who had spent years hiding in plain sight, someone who had relied on silence to protect himself. But the silence had finally broken, and the truth had finally spoken. Jessica Dishon's life was not defined by the way it ended. It was defined by who she was, a 17-year-old girl with a quiet smile and kind eyes. a daughter who respected her parents, helped her younger brothers, and stayed out of trouble. She worked hard, studied with purpose, and dreamed of becoming an accountant one day. She loved animals. She was responsible. She had goals. She was just starting to find her independence. And in the face of something dark and unspeakable, she found her voice. When she told her uncle no, when she decided to confide in someone, she was standing up for herself for the first and final time. That moment of courage cost her everything, but it also revealed her strength. Jessica's story reminds us how fragile trust can be and how often the people who cause harm are the ones closest to home. It reminds us how important it is to listen, to act, and to believe. It also reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Detective Lynn Hunt gave Jessica her voice back. She uncovered the truth and gave the Dishon family something they had lived without for nearly 15 years. Answers. And though the sentence was far too short and the pain far too deep, the silence had been broken. Stanley Dishon was no longer hiding. His victims were no longer quiet, and Jessica was no longer forgotten. Today, her family still remembers her, in the way they fight for victims' rights, in the way they speak out against abuse, in the way they keep her room just as she left it. Jessica's story may have ended far too soon, but her memory lives on in the truth that was finally uncovered. A story once buried, now told, gently, clearly, and with the care she deserved. Thank you for staying with us. This next story is story 2, a new chapter, a new case, and another voice that deserves to be remembered. If this is your first time listening to True Crime Whispers before sleep, I gently invite you to subscribe and like, so you never miss a single story we share. Each case here is told with care, honesty, and quiet respect. Some are forgotten stories, but they shouldn't be. Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin. March 19th, 2024, dawned like any other spring day in Brandon, Mississippi. The quiet suburb, nestled just outside the state capital of Jackson, was known for its peaceful streets, good schools, and close-knit community. At 214 Ashton Way, the Smiley family home rested on a gentle curve of the neighborhood, surrounded by a stillness that only early morning could offer. Inside that modest home, 40-year-old Ashley Smiley was starting her day. A respected math teacher at the local high school, Ashley had built her life around numbers, logic, and structure, but more than that, around love. Her devotion to her daughter Carly and her husband Heath defined her world. Ashley had a calm presence, the kind that students trusted and colleagues admired. Even Heath, her husband of nearly 4 years, often spoke of her with warmth and admiration. She was just Ashley, he once said, smart, sweet, and always thinking of others. Their daughter Carly, from Ashley's previous marriage, was 14, brilliant, thoughtful, and unusually gifted. She and her mother shared a bond that many envied. Each weekday morning, the two rode together to the high school where Ashley taught and Carly studied. Their conversations were soft, often filled with quiet laughter or gentle advice. They shared books, jokes, favorite movies. At times, it felt like they were more like sisters than mother and daughter. On this morning, everything seemed the same. Ashley and Carly left the house at 7:30 a.m. for school. Keith, a physical therapist, headed out shortly after. The house quieted, with only the soft barks of their 2 golden retrievers, Wyatt and Finn, echoing down the hallway. The sun warmed the sidewalks outside. Wind gently shifted the curtains. It was just another day, or so it seemed. What no one knew was that this ordinary morning would be the last of its kind, a calm that would be shattered in ways no one could have imagined. And behind the gentle stillness of their routine was a storm quietly building, one that would change everything forever. Ashley Smiley had always seen teaching as more than a job. For her, it was a calling, a space where she could inspire minds and offer structure and kindness in a world that often lacked both. But above her love for math, her strongest devotion was to her daughter, Carly. To the outside world, Carly was exceptional. She was quiet but not withdrawn, incredibly intelligent, and unusually insightful for her age. She had skipped a full grade in elementary school and scored in the 93rd percentile on the ACT at only 13. Teachers marveled at her ability to explain complex problems in ways that made sense to her classmates. Her brilliance, though extraordinary, came with its own weight. Ashley was deeply proud of Carly. She wasn't just raising a bright student, she was nurturing a soul that thought deeply, felt deeply, and carried a mind that often ran ahead of itself. Their lives were full of little traditions, movie nights, bookstore visits, and long drives with just the two of them. Carly felt safe in her mother's orbit, and for years, Heath had watched this bond grow, joining it with open arms when he and Ashley married. The wedding, held in the mountains on the balcony of a small cabin, was intimate and simple. Just Ashley, Heath, and Carly. No big guest list, no chaos, just family. For Heath, it was one of the best days of his life. Carly had stood with them, witnessing their vows, and from that moment on, he treated her like his own. He cheered her on at tennis practice, played video games with her after school, and encouraged her curiosity at every turn. She was just this sweet, curious girl, Heath later said, always asking questions, always thinking. But as 2023 drew to a close, Ashley began noticing small changes in Carly. Moments where the light in her eyes seemed dimmer, conversations where her voice was more distant. Carly, once eager to engage, began pulling back. Her energy dipped. Her once joyful mood seemed to grow quieter. Then came the discovery no parent is ever prepared for. Carly had been cutting herself. Ashley acted quickly. She reached out to their pediatrician, who referred Carly to the mental health clinic. There, Carly was diagnosed with depression and prescribed a low dose of Zoloft, an antidepressant often used to stabilize mood in teens. Alongside the medication, she began therapy with a counselor named Rebecca. Still, something didn't feel right. At 50 milligrams, Carly began feeling numb, disconnected, as if her emotions were slipping through her fingers. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was flatness, emptiness. She told her therapist, but the medication only changed once more, this time to Lexapro. But even with the adjustments, Carly's emotional state worsened, and behind the scenes, something much more complicated may have been at play, something that had been waiting quietly beneath the surface for years. Dr. Andrew Clark, a seasoned forensic psychiatrist specializing in children and adolescents, was brought in to evaluate Carly when her condition became increasingly concerning. From the first session, Dr. Clark sensed that something had been missed. In his view, Carly's behavior didn't fully align with a straightforward diagnosis of depression. Instead, he believed Carly may have been struggling with bipolar II disorder, a condition marked by cycles of deep sadness and brief episodes of high energy or agitation. While the moments of elation might not seem troubling at first, they can mask a far more dangerous instability. Treating bipolar II with antidepressants alone, Dr. Clark explained, is like trying to sail without a keel. You might move forward, but the direction is erratic. You can crash just as easily as you float. There was another detail that deepened his concern. Carly's biological father had a known history of bipolar disorder. The condition is highly genetic. If one parent carries it, the chances of their child developing it rise significantly. Ashley had always feared that Carly might inherit more than just her father's eyes or way with words. Their history was stained by pain. When Carly was just 4, her younger sister passed away from an illness. That loss created an unbridgeable crack between Ashley and her former husband. The grief festered, the marriage dissolved, and Ashley, with a small daughter in her arms, had to leave, reportedly in the dead of night, terrified. Though Carly was young, she remembered pieces. She spoke of arguing, of emotional distance, and of a night when her mother said she'd been hurt, physically. Carly never saw it happen with her own eyes, but she remembered her mother's injuries and the fear that followed. Over the years, court-ordered visits with her biological father continued, but the visits were hollow. He'd just sit in his chair and stare, Carly told the doctor. Wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't even offer me food. One particular incident stayed with her. She'd been only 6 when she ran and hid under a bed after her father scared her. She described him as erratic, unpredictable, someone who seemed angry at the world. By the time Carly entered her teens, the situation had worsened. She came home from visits withdrawn and shaken. Heath later revealed that Carly's father had exposed her to drugs, possibly even let her drink alcohol. Ashley, in turn, kept a loaded revolver in the nightstand beside her bed, fearful always that her ex might show up unannounced. In early 2024, Ashley began pursuing legal changes to their custody arrangement. She wanted Carly to be protected, but custody battles are never clean, and Ashley knew it would take strength, patience, and possibly months in court. All the while, Carly continued to spiral, and no one, not even Ashley or Heath, could fully grasp the depth of the storm their daughter was facing. By early March 2024, the calm inside the Smiley household was becoming more fragile. Ashley, ever composed, never let on how worried she truly was, but to those closest to her, it was becoming clear. Something about Carly had changed, and not just on the surface. At school, Carly's demeanor had shifted. Teachers who once praised her focus noticed her drifting off. Friends who had once relied on her warmth now found her quiet, moody, and at times irritable. Even her best friend, a classmate we'll call Tommy to protect his identity, began to worry. Tommy and Carly had met 2 years earlier at a football game. They connected instantly, two thoughtful, curious minds drawn together in a sea of teenage noise. Tommy admired Carly's brilliance. She never flaunted it. In fact, she often used it to help others. She wasn't like most people, he later said. She got things, not just in class, emotionally too. But in those final weeks before everything fell apart, Tommy saw something else, something darker. Carly had begun using a burner phone, a second secret device she hid from her mother. On it, she sent private messages, watched videos late into the night, and lived in a digital world beyond her parents' reach. She also began vaping marijuana, a discovery that troubled Tommy deeply. Carly, the rule follower, the honor student, now experimenting with substances and secrecy. It didn't make sense, but it was real, and it scared him. Then came the day everything shifted. March 19, 2024. At lunch inside the school cafeteria, Carly spilled a drink. Tommy, trying to lighten the mood, made a small joke, but Carly's reaction was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Sharp, explosive, and completely out of character. She lashed out, angry and trembling. Tommy stared, stunned. This wasn't the girl he knew. Something wasn't right. He approached Ashley that afternoon, just before classes ended. He didn't want to betray Carly's trust, but he felt responsible. Inside a quiet classroom, away from the noise of the school, he told Ashley everything. The burner phone, the vaping, the late-night messages. Ashley listened calmly. She didn't raise her voice or break down. But Tommy noticed something shift in her face, a quiet sadness, a disappointment deeper than anger. The final bell rang. Ashley and Carly left school together, just like they always did. They walked to the car, drove home. No one knows exactly what was said in that car, or if any words passed between them at all. But what we do know is that within minutes of arriving home, everything changed, and there would be no going back. It was a little past 4:14 p.m. when Heath received the text. A simple message, just 7 words. "Are you almost home, honey?" It came from Ashley's phone. There was nothing unusual in the words themselves. They were the kind of messages spouses exchanged every day, but something about it felt off. Heath couldn't say why. Maybe it was the tone, the timing, or the way the message lacked her usual punctuation and warmth. Still, he responded quickly, "No, I'll be here a little bit yet at work." And then he went back to his day, unaware that his life was already unraveling. Back at 214 Ashton Way, the house stood quiet again, the dogs resting somewhere near the back door. Everything seemed ordinary, still, but within its walls something unthinkable had already occurred. At around 5 p.m., Heath pulled into the driveway and stepped inside. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The air was still, the lights were on. The dogs barked faintly in the background, but as Heath approached the kitchen, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. The back door was open, just a few inches, maybe 3 or 4, but wide enough to feel wrong. He reached out, pushed it open, and then gunfire. A flash, a burst, then another. Before his brain could even process what was happening, bullets were slicing the air around him. He stumbled back, pain searing into his shoulder. Blood rushed down his arm. For a moment he didn't understand. Who was shooting? Where was Ashley? Then through the chaos and blur he saw her. Carly, his stepdaughter. Her face was wild with fear. Her hands trembled. She held the revolver with both hands struggling under its weight. She screamed something, but the words were lost in the ringing in Heath's ears. "She didn't recognize me," Heath would later say. "It was like she was somewhere else. Lost." He stumbled toward her. She backed away, still holding the gun. But Heath, driven by instinct and disbelief, wrestled the weapon from her grip. She stumbled into the kitchen island, then turned and ran, straight out the back door and into the yard. Heath didn't chase her, he couldn't, because something told him there might be someone else. Another shooter, another threat. He turned back toward the house, checking each room slowly, carefully. Bedroom, bathroom, closet. He moved with caution, adrenaline driving his every step. Then he reached the spare bedroom. There on the floor was Ashley. She was lying on her back. Her arms were gently crossed over her chest. A towel was draped over her face. Heath froze. His breath caught. Ashley was gone, shot 3 times, each one fatal. She hadn't stood a chance. The woman he loved, the mother of his stepdaughter, the anchor of their home, was now a quiet figure on the bedroom floor. And just like that, the world he knew had ended. Heath's hand shook as he picked up the phone. His voice was hoarse, broken, barely holding together. The call to 911 was desperate, panicked. Words stumbled over one another as he tried to explain that he'd been shot, that his wife had been shot, that his stepdaughter had run off into the yard. Kevin Collins, the dispatcher on duty that evening, answered the call. At first he thought he was speaking with a woman. The voice was so high, so strangled by shock. It wasn't until Heath gave his name that the dispatcher realized he was hearing a man pushed to the edge of comprehension. Heath described everything as best he could. Carly had pulled the trigger. Ashley was on the floor in their spare bedroom. The revolver had been used. He didn't know where Carly had gone. She had run into the woods. She might be hiding. She might be hurt. She might not be alone. Deputy Hunter Lewis was the first to arrive at the scene. The door was unlocked. Heath was standing near the entrance, trembling, blood on his shirt, eyes wide. Deputy Lewis guided him outside, onto the porch, and slowly began to make his way through the house. Nothing prepared him for what he found in the bedroom. Ashley Smiley lay flat on her back. A towel covered her face. Her arms were gently crossed over her chest. There was no pulse, no breath. The scene was quiet, almost peaceful. like someone had tried to honor her even after taking her life. Ashley's presence in the room didn't scream of violence. It whispered of something else, something intentional. Meanwhile, the search for Carly had begun. Officers moved through the neighborhood. Helicopters swirled overhead, and deputies scanned the woods behind the house. She was on foot, possibly injured, possibly still armed. There was fear in every direction, fear for Carly, fear of her, and fear of what she might do next. Then, 30 minutes later, a breakthrough. A deputy spotted a figure crawling out of a drainage pipe near a traffic stop. It was Carly. She was soaking wet, covered in grime. Her hair was matted, her hands scraped. The deputy approached gently, asking if she was Carly Gregg. Carly looked up and simply asked, "Is my stepdad okay?" It was the first thing she said. She didn't ask about her mother. Not once, not even a whisper. The deputy gently placed her in the back of the squad car and began driving to the station. Along the way, Carly spoke again, briefly. She asked about Heath, never about Ashley. It was a detail that investigators would never forget, a silence that said more than words ever could. Had Carly forgotten, or had she already known? As the sun dipped below the trees in Brandon, investigators at the Rankin County Sheriff's Department found themselves grappling with an impossible question. How does a 14-year-old girl with no criminal history and a reputation for brilliance suddenly turn a gun on her mother? Detectives gathered in the small interview room where Carly sat, still damp from the ditch, still quiet. When questioned, she claimed she remembered nothing. From the time she arrived home until the moment she was found in the drainage pipe, her memory was blank. 90 minutes of her life erased. She didn't mention the gun. She didn't speak of Ashley. She didn't ask again about Heath. That silence left detectives uneasy. But before they could press her further, something else happened. A knock at the front door of the station. Detective Tyler Burnett opened it to find a man standing there with his teenage daughter. The girl, whose name was withheld for her protection, was one of Carly's close friends. Her father had brought her in voluntarily. He said she had something to share, something urgent. The detective sat her down and listened. The girl told them Carly had called and messaged her repeatedly that afternoon. Carly said it was an emergency. She begged her to come over, and so the girl's father drove her to the Smiley residence and dropped her off, just as he'd done many times before. But nothing about that day was like the others. When she arrived, Carly greeted her at the door and asked a strange question. "Do dead bodies make you squeamish?" The girl, confused, said she didn't think so. Carly nodded and quietly led her into the house. She brought her not to the living room or the kitchen, but to the spare bedroom, where Ashley Smiley lay lifeless on the floor, her face covered by a towel. Carly stood beside her mother's body, holding a large silver revolver. Then, without emotion, she turned to her friend and said, "I shot her 3 times." The friend was stunned. She didn't scream or run, just froze. Carly then asked if she wanted to wait in the backyard until Heath came home. The girl nodded, numb. They stepped outside, and moments later the front door opened. Heath had arrived. The friend heard the gunshots, 3 more. Then Carly came sprinting out the back door, and they ran. They jumped the fence, split up at the driveway. The friend ran to another house. Carly ran into the woods. This witness account removed all doubt. There was no unknown intruder, no mistaken identity. Carly had confessed calmly and clearly to a friend. Now, the detectives knew they weren't searching for the truth anymore. They were preparing for trial. With the shock of Carly's confession sinking in, investigators turned their attention back to the Smiley home. They needed evidence, clear, irrefutable proof of what had happened inside the house that day. Fortunately, the house was equipped with security cameras. One at the front door, one in the garage, and one in the kitchen. where Ashley and Carly had first entered upon returning home. The front door camera showed Carly and Ashley arriving together at just before 4 p.m. There was no shouting, no signs of tension, just a mother and daughter returning home from school like they had done countless times before. Later, the same footage captured Heath arriving just before 5 p.m. Though the gunshots weren't visible, they could clearly be heard. Seconds later, the camera caught Carly and her friend jumping the backyard fence and disappearing from view. Then came the discovery that would raise more questions than answers. The kitchen camera was missing. It was simply gone. Investigators had overlooked it during their first sweep of the house, but when Heath returned from the hospital and began reviewing the footage himself, he noticed the gap. The kitchen camera, which should have recorded everything. The confrontation, the gunfire, the moments leading up to Ashley's final breath was nowhere to be found. Heath knew it had been there. He'd installed it himself. He began searching the house from top to bottom, drawers, closets, cabinets. He went through bags, checked under furniture, sifted through garbage. Days passed, nothing. Ashley's funeral was held on March 28th. Still, there was no sign of the camera or the missing SD card. But Heath didn't give up. He couldn't, not until he knew the full truth. Then, 15 days after the murder, he found it. While cleaning out the refrigerator, gathering water bottles, and organizing leftovers, he discovered the camera tucked in the very back of the fridge, hidden beneath bags of food. He turned it over to police immediately. Now, the final puzzle piece was in their hands, and once detectives pressed play, the truth, undeniable, chilling, finally revealed itself. The footage began quietly. From the kitchen camera's perspective, Ashley and Carly walked into the house together. Ashley, as always, was calm. She placed her purse gently on the kitchen island. Carly set her backpack down on a nearby chair. Nothing seemed out of place. No anger, no shouting, no tension. Ashley walked off screen, likely toward another room. Carly stayed behind, still focused. Then she moved toward the dogs, Wyatt and Finn, letting them outside through the back door. She closed it softly, then turned and walked with quiet purpose across the room. She passed in front of the camera, a large revolver tucked behind her back. Her posture was steady, her hands sure. There was no tremble in her fingers, no hesitation in her steps. Carly looked around the corner, making sure Ashley was still in the room just beyond. She took a breath, and then she went in. The camera couldn't see what happened next, but the microphone picked it up. Bang. A pause. Bang. Another breath. Bang. 3 shots, each one deliberate, close together, with only a moment in between. No shouting, no argument. Just a single muffled scream from Ashley. And then silence. Moments later, Carly came back into frame. She approached the kitchen island, reached into Ashley's coat pocket, took her phone. She set the revolver gently on a bar stool. No panic, no rush. Then she sat down. She picked up the phone, opened the messaging app, and typed, "Are you almost home, honey?" She sent the message to Heath. Then she stood, grabbed the gun again, and walked to the front of the house, right past the camera, her movements calm and controlled. She removed the camera from the kitchen wall, carefully unhooking it and turning it off. That was the last image recorded before everything went dark. Detectives sat in silence when the footage ended. The room felt heavier than before. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This wasn't a mistake or a struggle gone wrong. This was a calculated act, and Carly knew exactly what she was doing. The courtroom was quiet as Carly Massengill Gregg entered, her small frame almost swallowed by the standard issue clothing. Despite being just 14 years old, she was being tried as an adult, facing charges of first-degree murder and attempted murder. If convicted, she could spend the rest of her life behind bars. It had been 6 months since the events of March 19, 2024. The evidence was clear. The confession to her friend, the recovered security footage, the witness statements, and yet Carly and her defense team had chosen not to accept the plea deal offered by the prosecution, 40 years in prison. Instead, they pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. In Mississippi, that was a difficult path to take. The legal standard was high. For a person to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, the defense had to prove that the accused did not understand the nature of their actions or could not tell right from wrong at the time of the crime. Carly's team argued just that. Her defense rested on mental illness, on Carly's long history of emotional challenges, memory lapses, mood swings, and confusion. They said she had been hallucinating, that she had experienced a psychotic break, that she couldn't recall what she had done, not because she was lying, but because she had been genuinely disconnected from reality. Dr. Andrew Clark, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Carly, took the stand. He testified that Carly had been experiencing auditory hallucinations since the age of 6, voices that told her she was different, that whispered things only she could hear, that sometimes comforted her, and other times pulled her into darker thoughts. He diagnosed her with bipolar II disorder and an unspecified schizophrenia spectrum condition. I don't believe she understood the difference between right and wrong that day, Dr. Clark told the jury. I believe she was in a full-blown psychotic state. She wasn't present in the way you and I are. Carly's own diary was introduced as evidence. In one chilling entry, she wrote, "I think I had a psychotic break earlier. I actually spoke to one of the voices in my head. I sound crazy." The defense also leaned on Heath Smiley, the man Carly had shot, the man who had lost his wife and nearly lost his life. Heath had every reason to turn away from her forever, and yet he didn't. Heath stood by Carly even as she faced trial. He acknowledged her confusion. He believed she had been slipping for months, that she had stopped being herself long before the day she pulled the trigger. "She wasn't well," he said quietly on the stand, and none of us saw how deep it went. While Carly's defense team leaned heavily on her documented mental health history, the prosecution pushed back with force. They brought in their own forensic psychiatrist, who had also evaluated Carly. He testified with a firm tone. "Carly Gregg knew what she was doing. She understood the nature and consequences of her actions. She planned this." He pointed to the sequence of events, retrieving the revolver, hiding it behind her back, positioning herself to avoid the kitchen camera, and sending a deceptive text message to Heath. These, he said, were not the actions of someone in a psychotic state. They were the choices of someone in control. Prosecutors also highlighted the fact that Carly had never mentioned hallucinations or blackouts to her therapist in any of her 9 sessions earlier that year, nor had she brought them up during her medication adjustments. If the voices were truly so present, why had she kept them hidden? Then came the most damning piece of testimony. A close friend of Carly's, who claimed Carly had talked about wanting to hurt her parents before the crime. The friend testified that Carly had once messaged them, "I want to kill my mom and dad. 3 shots, 1 for each." The courtroom went still. It was the kind of evidence that reshaped a jury's entire understanding of motive. The prosecution argued that Carly had been spiraling. Yes, but not out of touch with reality. They believed she had been angry about being caught vaping, worried about losing privileges, and possibly terrified of the custody battle Ashley had reopened. They said Carly had panicked, and in that panic decided to act. They played the kitchen footage again for the jury, frame by frame. Carly entering, Carly moving deliberately, Carly firing. Each step looked precise, calm, deliberate. "This was not a breakdown," the prosecutor said in closing. "This was a decision." Still, the defense stood by their claim. They reminded the jury that mental illness doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it hides behind high-functioning brilliance, behind polite smiles, behind the image of a model student. And in Carly's case, they said, that's exactly what happened. After weeks of testimony, expert opinions, witness accounts, and tearful statements, the case was finally handed to the jury. They were tasked with answering a heavy question. Was Carly Gregg legally insane at the time she killed her mother and attempted to kill her stepfather? Mississippi law demanded a strict standard. To be found not guilty by reason of insanity, Carly had to be incapable of understanding what she had done or unable to know that it was wrong. It wasn't about emotional distress or even a diagnosis. It was about legal awareness, conscious choice. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Inside the packed courtroom, Carly sat quietly between her attorneys. Heath Smiley was also present, solemn but calm. The entire room held its breath as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Carly Massengill Gregg, guilty of first-degree murder. A hush fell. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of attempted murder. The judge thanked the jurors for their service. Carly sat motionless. Her face didn't change. There was no outburst, no protest, just stillness. Then came the next phase, sentencing. Because Carly had been charged as an adult, the jury would also decide how she would be punished. They stepped back out for deliberation. They returned in less than an hour. The sentence was announced clearly. Life in prison. A girl who had just turned 14 was now facing the reality of spending most, if not all, of her life behind bars. There was no clapping, no celebration, just quiet. Tears from Ashley's family, a deep breath from Heath, and silence from Carly. The courtroom emptied slowly as people tried to make sense of a story that didn't seem real. A daughter with no history of violence, a mother beloved by students and neighbors, a family shattered by something no one had seen coming, at least not in time. But even as the legal chapter closed, one truth remained. No one truly understood what had happened inside Carly's mind. Not the experts, not the jury, not even Carly herself. In the weeks following the sentencing, Carly's defense team filed a motion to appeal the verdict. They cited newly emphasized evidence, records that suggested Carly had been experiencing auditory hallucinations since early childhood. They argued that this added weight to her original claim of psychosis during the crime. The motion was detailed. It outlined her history, the early signs of mental illness, the troubling diary entries, the medication adjustments that may have worsened her state, and her family's legacy of bipolar disorder. Her defense insisted the jury had failed to consider the full scope of her condition, focusing too narrowly on legal definitions instead of clinical truth. But the prosecution countered with their own firm stance. They maintained that Carly's actions, retrieving the gun, texting Heath, hiding the camera, were not impulsive or erratic. They were structured, thought out, clear, and no mental illness, they argued, could erase that kind of deliberateness. Meanwhile, Heath Smiley remained silent in the public eye. He had lost his wife. His stepdaughter had nearly taken his life, and yet he still showed signs of compassion. Privately, he spoke to counselors about Carly's mental health. He remained one of the few people who didn't rush to label her as evil or irredeemable. But grief doesn't need to shout to be loud. In the quiet days after the trial, the house on Ashton Way was emptied, furniture sold, photos packed away. The golden retrievers, Wyatt and Finn, were taken in by family, and the home where laughter once echoed in the mornings became just another empty house on a quiet street. Brandon, Mississippi, once known for its low crime rate and peaceful neighborhoods, now carried a shadow. Neighbors passed the house with downcast eyes. Teachers at Carly's school whispered her name with confusion. Her classmates, most just beginning to understand the weight of adulthood, were left wondering how someone so bright could fall so far. And still, people asked, was it mental illness? Was it anger? Was it something no one will ever truly understand? There were no easy answers, only loss. Through all the headlines, the trial coverage, and the public shock that followed, there was one voice often left in silence: Ashley Smiley's. Her name was spoken in court, in news clips, and by detectives recounting evidence. But to those who knew her, she wasn't a headline or a victim. She was a woman who loved fiercely, gave freely, and lived with quiet grace. Ashley had been a dedicated teacher, known throughout the school for her patience and unwavering belief in every student. Former pupils remembered how she stayed late to help them study, how she brought calming energy into classrooms filled with teenage chaos, and how she never lost her gentle tone, even when correcting a mistake. She was the kind of teacher students didn't forget, but beyond the classroom, she was a mother first. Ashley had raised Carly almost entirely on her own for years before Heath came into their lives, and in that time she had poured everything into her daughter: her time, her focus, her love. From school projects to bedtime rituals, Ashley was always there. She made birthdays special. She sat through every practice. She celebrated every victory and held Carly through every heartbreak. Even when she noticed Carly's emotional changes, Ashley didn't ignore them. She acted, seeking therapy, finding a psychiatrist, adjusting medication, attending sessions. She fought for Carly, and when she began to fear for her daughter's safety around her biological father, she didn't hesitate to take legal steps. Even though it meant more court, more conflict, more stress, she pursued it, not for herself, for Carly. Ashley's friends would later say her world revolved around her daughter. Even in her final moments, she had no idea the danger she faced. There was no confrontation, no raised voice. She walked into her home with the woman she loved most in the world, believing it was just another afternoon. Her death left a hole that cannot be filled, not by justice, not by answers, not even by time. Her students carry her memory, her friends carry her stories, and Heath, in his quiet grief, carries a love that will never truly fade. The courtroom is empty now. The headlines have faded, but the aftermath lingers, quiet and heavy, like fog that never fully lifts. Carly Gregg, now just beginning her teenage years, faces life behind bars. The cell she occupies is not just concrete and steel. It is a place shaped by questions that may never be answered. What happened inside her mind that day? Was it rage, confusion, illness, or something else entirely? Even now, she says she doesn't remember what happened between the time she walked through her front door and the moment she was found crawling from a drainage pipe. 90 minutes, lost or hidden. And that blank space is where so much of this story still lives. Her legal team continues to fight for her future, arguing that her mental illness runs deeper than the system allowed itself to see. They speak of psychosis, of hallucinations, of pressure building silently until it shattered. And Heath, he continues his life in the same town, surrounded by memories. He has not spoken publicly since the trial ended, not about Carly, not about Ashley, but those who know him say he has moments, small ones, when he still talks about Ashley's laugh, about the way she kept everything organized, or how she loved simple things like a new book or a weekend drive. He still refers to Carly as my daughter. There are no winners in this story, just a beautiful woman gone too soon, a gifted teenager lost inside herself, and a man who loved them both, left to make sense of the silence. Brandon, Mississippi has returned to its quiet rhythm. The trees still sway in springtime. The school bell still rings. But for one house on Ashton Way, nothing will ever be the same. And for everyone who followed this story, Whether through news reports, whispered conversations, or quiet reflection, there's a lesson that echoes long after the last page. Even the brightest minds can carry the deepest pain, and sometimes the people we think are safest are the ones most in need of help. Thank you for spending this time with us as we shared Jessica Dishon's story. Stories like hers remind us of the importance of listening, of looking closer, and of never giving up on the truth, even when it hides in the quietest places. If this story moved you or gave you something to reflect on, remember her. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. We share a new case every evening. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and rest easy.